The bull everyone feared became a poor cowboy's greatest protector for life. The first time I saw Devil, he was standing in the middle of a collapsed fence section with 3 dead men's worth of rope dragging off him and a look in his eye that said he'd kill a 4th if one showed up. Nobody moved. 7 cowboys, 2 of them older than dust, and not one of them breathed loud enough to matter. I stepped out from behind the water trough because I was 23 and too broke to be smart and said, "Somebody's going to have to." Cullen Bray, who ran the spread, looked at me the way men look at something they're about to see die. "Go ahead, Holt," he said. My name is Everett Holt. I was nobody then, I want to be clear about that. I'd come up from the Texas Panhandle with $11 and a horse that died in the first hard freeze, and by the time I landed on Bray's outfit I was sleeping in the hay loft and eating what was left after the real hands finished. I wasn't even on the payroll. I was an arrangement. You work, you eat, we see how you do. 3 months of that and I still didn't have a bunk inside. So I had nothing to protect, and Devil could see it. That's the only explanation I've got for what happened next, and I've had 40-some years to think it over. I walked up to that bull slow, the way you'd walk toward something sleeping you didn't want to wake, and I kept my hands down and I kept my eyes off his. Not submissive. Just not a challenge. A neutral thing. A man-shaped thing that wasn't afraid, but wasn't looking for a fight either. He swung his head, 2,000 pounds of Hereford with a horn spread wide as a wagon tongue. The ropes dragged in the dirt. I stopped about 10 feet off and just stood there. He blew out through his nose, once hard. I didn't move. He took 1 step toward me, and I held. Then he dropped his head and stood still, and I don't know what passed between us in that moment. I've never been the kind of man to make claims about what animals feel or think, but something settled. Some arrangement got made that I've never been able to put into words, but that both of us understood perfectly from that afternoon forward. I walked up and picked up one of the trailing ropes. He let me. Behind me I heard Cullen Bray say something low that I didn't catch, and one of the older hands said, "Well, I'll be damned." That was the beginning of a different life, though I didn't know it yet. Bray put me on the payroll the next morning. A bunk inside, regular wages, and 1 unofficial assignment that nobody had to spell out. Wherever Devil went, I went. Which suited me fine because wherever I went, the other hands gave me a wider berth, and that suited me even finer. Devil was a breeding bull. Probably the most valuable animal on the whole range in terms of what Bray stood to make off him. But he'd killed a man in Wyoming before Bray bought him, badly injured 2 others in the buying pen, and developed a reputation that preceded him by about 40 miles in any direction. Other outfits had tried to work him. A couple of them tried to break him, which is the stupidest thing you can do to a breeding bull, and he'd responded the way any creature responds to someone trying to break its spirit, which is to say badly and permanently. I never tried to break him. That's the whole secret. I just showed up every day and was consistently myself, which wasn't much, but it was reliable, and I think that mattered to him. He'd had nothing reliable. Animals aren't stupid about that. They remember every betrayal and they remember the hands that didn't betray them, and after a while they start to know the difference before anything's even happened. By the 2nd month I could move him anywhere on the range, just by walking ahead of him and he'd follow. By the 3rd I could work the fence gaps around him, fix wire within 10 yards of him, even reach under him to check a hoof if something in his gait looked off. The other hands watched this like I was performing some kind of dark trick, and eventually they stopped trying to understand it and just accepted it the way you accept weather. What I didn't expect was what it would mean beyond the cattle work. Nora Cleave's place was 3 miles east on the far side of the coulee, 160 acres she'd held onto for 5 years since her husband Walter died of a chest sickness that came in one November and was done with him by March. No children. A hired man named Jesper who was 63 and had a bad knee and couldn't do the heavy work anymore but had nowhere else to go. a milk cow, a small beef herd, maybe 40 head, that she ran herself with Jesper's help. I knew who she was. Everybody in the county knew who she was. She'd become one of those women that men talk about the way they talk about a river with a bad reputation. Not meanly, not unkindly, just with a kind of respect that comes from watching something hold its shape against a current that would have taken most things apart. I'd seen her twice. Once at the mercantile in town, once riding the fence line that abutted Bray's south pasture. Both times she'd looked at me the way she looked at everything, which was straight on and like she was making up her own mind and didn't require any input. I didn't think much about her beyond that. I was poor, I was working. I was 31 years old with nothing to show for it except an arrangement with a bull that nobody else could get near. Then the trouble came. Bray sold a parcel of his southwest range in the spring, 30 acres along the coulee, to a man named Totham Greer who'd come out of Missouri with money and ambition, and the kind of smooth manners that tend to go with one or the other. Greer wanted to run cattle, and he wanted water access, and he wanted to expand, and the parcel he bought put him directly between Bray's land and Nora Cleave's east fence. I noticed the way Greer looked at Nora's place the first time he rode the boundary line. He didn't look at it like a neighbor looks at land. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he's already decided to have. Jesper came over to our side of the coulee about 6 weeks after Greer arrived, asked to speak to whoever was in charge, and ended up talking to me because Bray wasn't around. He was a short man with a red face, and he twisted his hat brim while he talked, and he told me that Greer's hands had started pushing Nora's cattle back off the water in the dry section, that one of them had cut her south fence on a pretense, and that 2 days ago one of Greer's men had ridden up to the house and told Nora that Mr. Greer would pay her a fair price for the property if she was finding it a burden. She told him what he could do with his price, Jesper said, and for a second something almost like a smile moved over his face and then went away. But there's 3 of them now, and there's me, and my knee's gone, and Mrs. Cleave, he stopped, looked down at the hat brim. She's not afraid, that's the problem. She's not afraid, and she should be a little. I told him I'd look into it. Jesper nodded like that was exactly what he'd come to hear, which surprised me, since I'd meant it as something to say. I didn't tell Bray, not right away. That was a calculated decision, and I'll own it. Bray was a fair man, but he was a businessman first, and Greer had money, and I wasn't sure which direction Bray would lean if it came to a negotiation. So I rode over to Nora Cleave's place on my own time, on a Sunday afternoon, and I knocked on the door. She opened it and looked at me. She was 40, maybe 41, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and she had the kind of face that doesn't give anything away but isn't closed off either, it's just self-possessed. Waiting on facts before it renders a verdict. "You're the one with the bull," she said. "Everett Holt," I said. "I know who you are." She stepped back from the door. "Come in if you have something to say." The house was spare and clean. There was a rifle on hooks by the door, which I noticed, and a Bible on the table that had the look of something actually read, which I also noticed. She poured coffee without asking if I wanted it and sat across from me, and folded her hands and waited. I told her what Jesper had told me, and I told her I thought it was likely to get worse before it got better, and she nodded slowly like this was confirming something she'd already calculated. "What I can't figure," she said, "is why you're here." It was a fair question, and I took a second with it. "Because what Greer's doing is wrong," I said, "and because Jesper came to me, and I think he came to me for a reason." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not going to tell me to sell." "No. Most men would." "Most men aren't here," I said. She almost smiled. It was brief, but it was real. I started writing Nora's fence line on my days off. Not making a show of it. Just present, which is the best deterrent there is. Greer's men saw me out there, and they were careful about what they did in ways they hadn't been before. I fixed the cut section of south fence on a Thursday and ran wire so tight you could have played a tune on it, and Nora brought water out to where I was working and stood and watched and didn't try to make conversation, which I appreciated. Devil had a pasture that ran to within a quarter-mile of her east fence. That gave me an idea. It took 2 weeks to make it happen in a way that didn't look arranged. I worked Devil's ranging pattern gradually, easing him east, letting him follow the good grass without any pressure, and by the 3rd week, he was grazing regularly within sight of Nora's fence line. Which meant I was regularly within sight of Nora's fence line. Greer's men started avoiding that section entirely. 2,000 pounds of Hereford bull with a known history will do that. Doesn't matter how tough a man thinks he is, he thinks twice about the ground. A bull like that is working. Bray figured out what I was doing eventually. He came out to the east pasture one evening and stood beside me watching Devil work the grass, and he said, "You realize that if Greer complains to me about the bull being near his fence line, I'm going to have to pull Devil back." "Yes, sir," I said. "You also realize that if Greer's men do something stupid near Devil, I'm going to have a dead man problem." "They're not going to do something stupid," I said. "They're not stupid. That's Greer's problem." Bray was quiet for a while. Then he said, "How much do you know about what's happening over on the Cleve place?" I told him. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at Devil moving through the grass. "Walter Cleve was a good man," he said finally. "I bought a horse off him once. Good horse." He turned and walked back toward the house, and that was the end of the conversation, but he never pulled Devil back. The trouble came to a head in early August. I was in Nora's yard replacing a gate hinge. She'd asked me to look at it, or Jesper had, I don't remember exactly, and one of Greer's men rode up to the fence and called out that Mr. Greer wanted to speak to Mrs. Cleve at her convenience, and that Mr. Greer was a patient man, but not an infinitely patient one. I kept working the hinge, didn't look up. The hand waited for Nora to respond. She came out of the house with a dish towel over her shoulder and looked at the man on the horse and said, "Tell Mr. Greer that Mrs. Cleve is occupied, and that Mr. Greer can write a letter if he has something to say in writing." The hand looked at me. I had a wrench in one hand and I was still crouched by the gate post, and I looked back at him with no particular expression. He rode off. Nora went back inside. I finished the hinge. When I stood up and tested the gate swung clean, latched solid, she was standing in the doorway watching. She had the dish towel still, folded over her forearm now, and there was something in her face that I hadn't seen there before. Not soft. Nothing like soft. More like a decision made. The way a face looks when something that was being weighed has finally been set down. "You don't have to keep coming over here," she said. "I know," I said. She nodded once, went back inside. But when I came around the following Sunday, she had a plate of food waiting. Greer made his move in September. He didn't send a hand this time. He came himself on a good horse in a good coat, with 2 of his men flanking him. He rode up the track to the house, and I was there because I was always there on Sundays by then, sitting on the porch steps with coffee, and he pulled up and looked at me for a moment and then looked past me at the door. "I'm here to speak to Mrs. Cleve," he said. "She knows you're here," I said. He waited. Nora didn't come to the door. Greer looked back at me. He was a composed man, I'll give him that. He didn't bluster. He just looked at me with the steady, measuring look of a man who's accustomed to getting what he wants through patience rather than force, and was recalculating. "You work for Bray," he said. "I do. And yet here you are on Bray's time." "It's Sunday," I said. He shifted his weight in the saddle. His 2 men were quiet and still and not making any kind of threat, just present in the way men are present when they're there to make a number. I counted that number against what I had, which was a wrench in my coat pocket and Devil in the east pasture, and whatever reputation had built up in 3 years of being the man nobody messed with on that piece of range, and I thought it was close to even. Then the door behind me opened. Nora came out and stood beside me at the top of the steps, not behind me, beside me, her shoulder 6 inches from mine. "Mr. Greer," she said. "Mrs. Cleve." He took his hat off, which was the right move, and he held it. "I think we've got a situation between us that doesn't have to be complicated." "I don't find it complicated," she said. "I own this land." "You'd like to own it. I don't want to sell. That seems simple." "The range is drying up, Mrs. Cleve. 2 bad winters, prices down." "Mr. Greer," she said quietly, "I have survived 2 bad winters and declining prices and 5 years alone and the death of my husband. I don't need your assessment of my situation. A beat. I think you should go." He looked at her for a long moment, then at me, then back at her. I couldn't read all of what was going on behind his eyes, but I saw the moment he measured what he had against what we had, and found the math didn't favor him the way he'd assumed it would. He put his hat back on. "I'll be around," he said, which is something men say when they've lost the conversation but aren't ready to call it permanent. "So will I," Nora said. He turned his horse and rode out, his men falling in behind him, and I listened to the hoofbeats fade down the track and into the coulee brush until there was just the wind and the sound of Devil somewhere out in the east pasture, moving through the grass. Nora let out a slow breath beside me, just one, then she was still. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wasn't already said. After a while she went inside and came back with the coffee pot and refilled my cup in her own and sat down on the step beside me, close enough that her arm was against mine. Neither of us moved away. We sat there for a long time looking out at the range. Greer didn't fold overnight. He was patient the way he'd said he was, and he made 2 more attempts over the next 6 weeks, a water rights dispute that went nowhere when Bray backed Nora's position, and a brief period where I was fairly certain his men were running Nora's cattle off the good graze at night. I rode night patrols for 2 weeks, lost sleep, ate cold food. My horse knew that section of range better than I did by the end of it. I found where they were coming through, and I fixed it, not dramatically, just wire and posts in the right places, and then I moved Devil's ranging pattern to cover that quarter. After that, the pressure stopped. Greer eventually sold the 30-acre parcel to a farmer from Illinois who wanted to grow wheat, which suited everyone fine. It wasn't a victory in any clean sense. Nothing fell apart for Greer. He just redirected. But the land was still Nora's, and the fence was still standing, and the cattle were where they were supposed to be, and that was the whole job as far as I was concerned. I want to be honest about something. I didn't ride over every Sunday because I was calculating. I didn't station Devil on that fence line purely as a tactical decision. Or, I mean, those things were true, but they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd been on that range for 3 years, and in all that time I'd never sat with anyone and felt like sitting was enough. I'd been welcome in the bunkhouse, respected on the payroll, valued for what I could do with a difficult animal. All of that was real, and I don't diminish it. But sitting on that porch with Nora in the late afternoon, the shadows getting long across the grass and Devil somewhere out of sight but present, that was the first time in a long time that I felt like myself was enough. Not what I could do, just what I was. She had that effect. She was a woman who paid attention to what was actually there rather than what she wished was there or what would be convenient, and what she decided was actually there, after enough Sundays of quiet and coffee and looking at the range and not saying too much, was something she wanted to be near. She told me that in October, plain and direct, the way she did everything. We were walking the south fence after supper, checking a post that had come loose in the clay soil, and she stopped and turned and looked at me and said, "I want you to know that what you've done here has mattered. and that I want you to keep coming around for reasons that have nothing to do with the fence or the bull or Greer." I looked at her. "Nora," I said. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I'm not asking for a declaration. I'm just being honest about where I stand, because I think you deserve to know, and I've been thinking about whether to say it for about 6 weeks." The fence post was crooked, and I reached over and put my hand on it, just to feel the solid wood, the cold of it in October, and I said, "I'll need to set that deeper. Clay heaves in the winter." "I know," she said. "I'll come back Saturday," I said. "I know that too," she said. And then she put her hand over mine on the fence post, just for a moment, her fingers cold and strong on the back of my hand, and then she moved off toward the house, and I stood there with the bent post and the fading light, and something settled in me that I haven't had reason to question since. We married the following spring. A small thing, Jesper, Bray, and 2 women from the church, in the yard on a May afternoon when the grass was coming in green and the air smelled like it had been recently cleaned by the wind. I moved on to the Cleve place. That surprised some people. A man working another man's outfit moving to his wife's land, working that instead, some read it as less than, as a step down. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as the clearest possible evidence of what I'd built and who I'd become, that a woman with good land and her own authority and no need to settle for half a thing had looked at what I was and decided it was what she wanted. I brought Devil with me. Bray sold him to me at a price that was more kindness than commerce, and Devil's calves went out across 4 counties over the next 8 years and built the herd that Nora and I ran together until he was too old to work. The day we retired Devil to the far pasture, just green grass and water and no more work asked of him, I walked him out there myself and pulled the halter and stepped back, and he stood for a moment looking at me with those dark flat eyes, and then turned and walked out into the grass like he'd been waiting for it. I watched him go. Nora came up beside me and stood there, her shoulder against mine. "Good bull," she said. "Best I ever knew," I said. We stood there till he was just a shape out in the pasture, and then we walked back to the house together in the long afternoon light, and that was that. I'm telling this in my late 60s now. Nora's gone 9 years chest sickness, the same thing that took Walter, which seems like a cruelty when I let myself think about it, and so mostly I don't. The land is still ours, mine and hers in the way that it stays yours even after. Our nephew runs it now and does it well. What I think about, when I let myself, is not the Greer trouble or the fence lines or even Devil. Though Devil I think about more than seems sensible for a man my age carrying on about a bull. What I think about is Nora saying, plain as weather, that she wanted me around for reasons that had nothing to do with what I was useful for. I'd spent a long time being useful. I was good at it. I was good at it precisely because I'd had to be, because useful was the only currency I had when I started, the only argument for my presence on any given piece of ground. And then this woman looked at me straight on and said, "The usefulness is fine, but that's not why I want you here. That's the thing that gets you when it comes. That's the thing a man carries." 40 years and I still reach for her shoulder in the morning, just for a moment, before I'm all the way awake and the world comes back in. It takes me a second to remember, and then I remember, and I get up anyway because there's work to do and the land doesn't wait, and she'd be annoyed with me for lying there. That's how it goes. I'm fine, the land's good. And sometimes, out in the far pasture where Devil used to graze, I stand for a minute in the afternoon light and look at the grass and feel the weight of all of it, every fence post, every Sunday, every cup of coffee gone cold on a porch step, and I think, that was a life. That was a real one. That was enough and then some.